The ground in the Klondike does not give up what it holds without a fight. It holds everything in a grip that precedes human memory by hundreds of thousands of years, frozen so deep and for so long that the act of breaking through it is less like digging and more like opening a vault that was never meant to be opened at all. When the gold miners arrived in their tens of thousands in 1897 and 1898, most of them came looking for one specific thing. But the frozen earth beneath their boots held something far stranger, and in the long run, far more consequential than any gold they would ever pan out of the creek gravel. What they pulled from the Klondike River Valley and the surrounding creek beds in the height of the rush was too old for any of them to explain, too old by an order of magnitude that the science of the day was barely equipped to process, and in many cases it was pushed aside, tossed back into the ground, or simply left where the hydraulic monitors had blasted it loose, because the men kneeling in the mud had come for something else entirely, and a mammoth skull, however spectacular, would not pay for the crossing. To understand what was frozen under the Klondike, you have to go back not years or centuries, but epochs. The Klondike is one of North America's most productive localities for the recovery of late Pleistocene mammal fossils. The goldfields contain a key record of Pleistocene Beringia, the region of Alaska, Siberia, and Yukon that remained largely unglaciated during the late Cenozoic, a concentration of mining exposures with relict permafrost that is locally more than 700,000 years old, provides exceptional preservation of paleoenvironmental archives. The permafrost of the Klondike is not ordinary frozen ground. It is a geological archive of almost incomprehensible depth, a cold, dark library in which the records have been accumulating since before our species existed. The ice in some of these deposits formed when creatures were wandering the earth that no living human eye has ever seen. It has been frozen without interruption, unthawing in summer, refreezing in winter, holding its contents in a kind of suspended time that makes the most ambitious human archive look ephemeral by comparison. Before Beringia was completely flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age during the glacial melt around 10,000 years ago, this area was home to a variety of ancient creatures. Everything from massive woolly mammoths to giant ground sloths to Yukon camels roamed the land. Scientists believe that megafauna thrived until climate change and overhunting by humans ultimately led to their extinction. The Klondike sits at what was the eastern edge of this vanished world, a world that was connected by exposed land all the way to Siberia, a single continental grassland supporting herds of animals that moved back and forth across what is now the Bering Sea. This land bridge was exposed during the Pleistocene epoch when global sea levels dropped significantly, allowing for a continuous land connection that measured over 600 miles at its maximum width. Beringia featured a tundra-like climate and supported a variety of migratory Pleistocene animals such as mammoths and reindeer, which attracted nomadic peoples from northeast Asia. Those animals, and the people who followed them, moved across a landscape that is now underwater. When the ice melted and the seas rose, Beringia disappeared, and the creatures that had lived on it either migrated south into the Americas or died. Many of them died right there in the Klondike Valley, and the permafrost sealed them where they fell. The Klondike Gold Rush was a migration by an estimated 100,000 prospectors to the Klondike region of Yukon in northwestern Canada between 1896 and 1898. The methods they used to get at the gold, hydraulic monitors, water cannons powerful enough to cut through frozen earth, fire thawing operations that melted the permafrost from below, were also, without any of the miners intending it, the most effective tool for recovering Pleistocene specimens that had ever existed. Every time a monitor was turned on a frozen creek bank, it was excavating 10,000 or 100,000 years of biological time. Gold miners dig through a frozen layer of soil called permafrost, where some animals have been preserved since the Ice Age. As they actively gold mine, they constantly uncover the remains of Ice Age animals like woolly mammoths. The men operating the monitors were not paleontologists, and they had no particular interest in what the frozen sediment contained beyond the gold. But the fossils came out anyway, tumbling from the cut walls of the creek banks, dropping from buckets and sluice boxes, emerging from the muck with teeth and horns and tusks intact. It should be no surprise that it was the discovery of mammoth bones that got everyone excited. 3 prospectors posed with a mammoth skull recovered from Quartz Creek during the gold rush around 1898. Stampeders at Sulphur Creek posed with mammoth tusks weighing 125 and 200 pounds each around 1900. The photographs that survive from this period have a particular quality to them. Men in mud-stained coats standing next to bones that dwarf them, grinning at the camera with the easy confidence of people who have just found something extraordinary and have no framework for understanding how extraordinary it actually is. The tusks in these photographs are longer than the men holding them. The skulls are the size of boulders, and they were being pulled from ground that had been frozen since before the last ice age ended, meaning they had been lying in their permafrost vault for at least 12,000 years, and possibly very much longer. Most Klondike faunas are dominated by the big 3 of Bering: steppe bison, woolly mammoth, and Yukon horse. Fossils of a less common species are recovered occasionally, including the western camel, American mastodon, American lion, short-faced bear, and helmeted muskox. Mummified or freeze-dried partial carcasses recovered from the Klondike highlight the role of permafrost in the preservation of the late Pleistocene paleontological record. Impressive mummified carcasses include a black-footed ferret and a Yukon horse, whose stomach contents have provided important dietary information. Stomach contents. A horse that died tens of thousands of years ago, recovered from frozen ground with its last meal still inside it, the half-digested grasses of an ancient steppe preserved in the permanent cold as faithfully as the teeth and the bones. This is what the Klondike held. This is what the miners were blasting through in their pursuit of placer gold. Many of them treated it accordingly. A mammoth skull weighing several hundred pounds is not something a prospector in 1898 has any practical use for. There was no market, no museum expedition yet organized to buy these things, no infrastructure for transporting them south. The vast majority of what came out of the permafrost in those first years went back into the ground by default, left on the creek bank where the Monitor had cut it loose, exposed to the brief Yukon summer, thawing and rotting for the first time in thousands of years, then refreezing or simply dissolving back into the muck. Back then, as now, monitors revealed not only gold but a wealth of fossils. People have been finding Ice Age fossils in the Klondike since the beginning of the gold rush, but finding them and preserving them were 2 very different things, and in 1898 the incentive structure rewarded only one. In 1904, scientists from the Natural History Museum in Paris arrived in the Klondike to collect the mysterious fossils. They were followed by international teams from the United States Biological Survey, the American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Canadian Museum of Nature. The scientists came because word had reached the institutions of the world that something extraordinary was being unearthed in the Yukon Creek beds, and they arrived with the equipment and the intention to take the best specimens south. The scientists' arrival marked the beginning of a unique collaboration between gold miners and paleontologists that continues to this day. As placer miners use heavy equipment and hydraulic water cannons to strip away permafrost and expose gold, government paleontologists are often on site collecting fossils. Every summer, Zazula and his colleagues collect between 6,000 and 8,000 bones. But what the scientists found when they arrived was a landscape already deeply altered by 6 years of industrial-scale hydraulic mining. Enormous amounts of permafrost had been displaced, creek banks had been cut back dozens of feet, and the biological material that had once been sealed in that frozen matrix had been exposed, thawed, and in most cases had already decomposed beyond recovery. The bones and tusks and skulls that the photographs showed, the mammoth tusk being displayed by grinning stampeders, the mastodon skull posed with for the camera, represented only a tiny fraction of what had actually been uncovered in the mining operations. Most of it had simply returned to the earth through the most ordinary process imaginable. It thawed and it rotted, and it was gone. This is the particular tragedy of the Klondike as a paleontological site, and it is the real story behind the title of this piece. The things pulled from the Klondike River Valley in 1898 were too old to explain, too old for radiocarbon dating, in many cases too old even for the conceptual frameworks that early 20th century scientists had available to them. And they were reburied not through any sinister intent, not through institutional suppression or deliberate concealment, but through the simple indifference of people who had come to find something else entirely, and who lacked the tools, the knowledge, and the incentive to do anything else with what the permafrost gave them. The scale of what was lost in those years is almost impossible to calculate. Gold miners dig through a frozen layer of soil called permafrost, where some animals have been preserved since the Ice Age. Without gold mining, it would be impossible to excavate through these frozen valleys. Using all this heavy equipment, they do all the excavation, and we collect all the fossils that are turned up as a result of that. That last sentence cuts both ways. The mining that has made modern paleontological recovery possible was also, in its earlier and more destructive incarnation, the force that destroyed an unknowable quantity of the very record it was simultaneously revealing. What makes this history especially sharp is what the permafrost of the Klondike has since been shown to contain, not merely unusual specimens, but material of a depth and quality that science is still, more than a century later, only beginning to fully exploit. A horse bone recovered from the Thistle Creek site in the Yukon's Klondike gold mines, found in permafrost that is locally more than 700 years old, yielded the genome of an ancient relative of modern-day horses. Thistle Creek is the oldest equine to have its DNA fully sequenced, and actually Thistle Creek's DNA is the oldest DNA of any species to be fully sequenced, 700,000 years old. The DNA survived because the permafrost never let it warm. Had it not been frozen for the entire duration of that 700,000 years, I doubt that any recoverable DNA would have survived. The cold of the Klondike permafrost is not incidental to the preservation, it is the preservation. The DNA is there because the ice never broke, which means that everything lost in those early years of the gold rush, everything thawed and left to rot on a creek bank in the summer of 1898, carried within it information that no laboratory on Earth will ever now be able to read. In 2008, gold miners in Hunker Creek collected a pile of Ice Age era bones that date back 75,000 to 125,000 years. A few peculiar specimens turned out to be several leg bones belonging to an extinct camel species whose remains are rarely found that far north. The bones were so well preserved in the cold conditions that researchers were later able to extract DNA. The genetic data showed Ice Age Western camels split off from modern-day camels around 10 million years ago. Ancestors of today's camels migrated across Beringia about 7 million years ago. Camels in the Yukon. The Klondike was camel country, horse country, mammoth country, lion country, a grassland megafauna landscape that supported enormous herds of animals and the people who hunted them. The hen were forcibly moved out of their traditional hunting grounds and into a reserve to make way for the prospectors, who exploited the land by cutting down much of the timber and leaving the land's former inhabitants without resources. The living custodians of this territory, the Klondike, descended from the hen who had inhabited the Yukon Valley for thousands of years, were displaced by the same rush that was simultaneously unearthing the evidence of an even older occupation of the land. The permafrost held the bones of animals that the ancestors of those people had hunted. The gold rush expelled the descendants and destroyed much of the archive that contained the record of their ancestors' world. The thing about the Klondike is that the reburying is still happening in a different way. As climate change advances, permafrost is thawing rapidly and releasing its contents, a gold rush of sorts for paleontologists. The biological material that survived the early mining operations, that was sealed back into frozen ground after the hydraulic monitors moved on, is now being released by a warmer world that is doing what no miner's water cannon could, thawing the permafrost from the surface downward, permanently, irreversibly. Everything that is coming out of the ground now in the Klondike is coming out for the second time. having survived the gold rush intact only to face a different kind of exposure. On June 21st, 2022, a near-complete mummified baby woolly mammoth was found in the Klondike gold fields. Geologists suggest that Nuncho Gar died and was frozen in permafrost during the Ice Age, over 30,000 years old. These amazing Ice Age remains provide an extremely detailed glimpse into a time when Nuncho Gar roamed the Yukon alongside wild horses, cave lions, and giant steppe bison. She had survived Antarctica inside the permafrost while everything else changed above her. She was named in the Han language by the descendants of the people whose territory she had been frozen under for 30 millennia. What they pulled from the Klondike River in 1898 was too old to explain. That is not quite right, though. It was too old for anyone there to have the tools to explain it, which is a different thing. The tools existed elsewhere, in the museums of Paris and Washington and London, in the hands of scientists who had dedicated their careers to exactly this kind of ancient biological material. But they were not in the Yukon in 189-8, and by the time the institutions sent their expeditions north, the creek banks had already given up their finest specimens to the summer air. What was reburied was not concealed. It was simply lost, quietly and completely, to the same permafrost that had preserved it for so long, or to the brief and brutal Arctic thaw. The gold rush found it, the gold rush destroyed most of it, and the rest of it is still down there, in the frozen dark, waiting for a world that knows, finally, how to treat it.